All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Evolution Podcast. So today I have a special guest. We're going to be discussing, I know you guys, if you've been watching this and you've been following us over the past few months since we started, primarily what we majorly speak about is about business. But I don't know if you guys know this about me. I'm a very big believer in God. I mean, then again, we live in a very interesting age and a different interesting time where even saying the word God could even be something where people might say, oh my God, how dare you say that? But today I have someone who's going to be talking. We're going to be cross talking between business. We're also going to be talking about faith. And Bart, our honored special guest today. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Bart Blair, and I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I've been in the business world for most of my adult life, but I have also served in ministry in churches and in some nonprofits over the course of the last 25 years. And even in this current season, I work full-time for a for-profit company that serves churches and nonprofits. But I also work for a ministry that does coaching and consulting for churches, helping churches get healthy, helping churches, reach their full potential and make an impact in the community that they want to make. And so that's a little bit of my background. I'm sure that as we get into the conversation deeper, we'll peel off a few layers and get into a little bit more of that.
Absolutely, we will. Absolutely. It's interesting. So you and the Dow, you would ask me early before we started the podcast. You're like, "Where do you live?" And I told you, but I actually used to live in Arlington, Texas. I don't know how
Okay.
far away you are from Arlington.
I am an hour or so. I'm in southeast Collin County, so McKinney, Plano, Frisco, that area. Arlington is obviously. I make it to Arlington a few times a year to watch Texas Rangers play. That's where the Rangers play. The Dallas Cowboys play. I'm actually going to a Billy Joel concert in Arlington in March.
Okay.
Going to see Billy Joel and Stevie Nicks at Jerry Jones World, where the Cowboys play. Yeah, okay. I'm not close to Arlington, but I'm there on a semi-regular basis, I guess.
Interesting. So how did you get started? So what's the background? Like, you mentioned you work for, we're going to get into the faith part, but you mentioned you work for a for-profit. So how'd you get into that? Is it more of a business? What's your role with that?
Yeah, so I work for a company that's called Missional Marketing, and Missional Marketing is a marketing company that serves organizations that are on mission. And our primary clientele is actually working with Christian churches. We work with all kinds of churches and all sizes of churches, primarily in North America, United States, and Canada. We do have some clients overseas and in Australia, but for the most part, we work with churches in the U.S. and Canada. Our primary focus is really to help churches leverage digital tools to increase their footprint in the communities that they're trying to reach. And we help them with SEO. We help them with anything and everything Google related. And then we run all kinds of different types of advertising campaigns on digital platforms that are accessible for churches. So it's a for-profit company, but we serve, like I said, predominantly churches and Christian nonprofits in that space. Prior to that, I actually was a pastor for about 15, 16 years, part of two church plants, startup churches, as you might call them. And I kind of ended up in that accidentally. I actually studied music in college, and my first career was in the performing arts. I studied vocal performance, and out of college, I spent about a half dozen years touring the United States and Canada, doing regional theater and bus and truck tours and working as a performer. Ended up in a corporate job for a few years, which was actually really cool, and I really loved it. And while I was in that corporate job, the company transferred me to Toronto. When I moved to Toronto, I met some guys that were starting a church in the Toronto area. I got involved in helping to start that church, and eventually left that corporate job to join the staff of that church as the worship pastor and creative arts director. And so I kind of transitioned from working in the creative arts to working in a corporate job for a little while, and then back into a space where I was able to use my music and my creative skills in the context of the church. And have been really since the early 2000s, since 2002, have been working primarily in church and Christian ministry work. But now a lot of overlap between the Christian ministry work and sort of the for-profit work that I do.
Okay, so which is very interesting. That's definitely a lot to unpack there. So, but the first thing I want to go ahead and pose a, if you don't mind, I want to pose a challenging question. So it
Sure.
might be a challenging question, but I wouldn't really say necessarily it's a challenging question. So, I would say about 3 months ago, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine about a new recent church that I go to. I attend a church, a very name brand church, and name ch- um name brand church here in the Carolinas. And I was like, "Have you heard of it?" It's like, "Yeah," but he goes, "I don't like the pastor." I was like, "Interesting. So why don't you like the pastor?" He goes, "Well, if you can't be a pastor, I don't believe in you being a pastor and being a man of God, and then you are worth millions of dollars. That's not true. That's not how it should be.
can,
That is."
can we start playing multiple choice and I can guess which church that you might be connected to? But we won't do that. We don't need to do that.
You can do. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you
No,
know
no,
the
no,
church.
no, no.
I'm
Yeah,
pretty
yeah.
sure, but I'm pretty sure you have an idea of the church I'm talking about. Well, which is a phenomenal. I go there pretty much every time, um, but he goes, I can't, I'm not bringing myself to go to that church because he makes money off his members, blah blah blah, that stuff. And I was like, I mean, okay, I guess. But he goes, well, the church that I grew up in, the pastor should be humble and all that stuff. And I'm very curious in just to ask you this question: do you believe that ministers or pastors in any way, shape, or form need to, I guess, make in some way have a decent living or even make any bit of money? Or what would you say to that?
Well, for starters, I would say there's a very big difference between making a decent living and making millions of dollars, for sure. I guess it depends on the economy that you that you live in.
Uh huh.
Here, let's kind of cut to the chase here. 95% of the churches in North America, in the United States anyway, have fewer than 500 people in them. So when we start talking about mega church pastors, and I would assume that, the church that you're a part of would probably fall into the category of mega church, especially if someone has that kind of reaction to the pastor and his earnings. A lot of times, the pastors of these large churches, they're making more of their money on things that they're doing outside of the context of their local church ministry. For instance, writing books. A lot of pastors who are living what we would consider, say, maybe a high life because they earn a good living. I think Rick Warren, who is the founding pastor of Saddleback Church, is a prime example of that. He made millions upon millions of dollars on his book, The Purpose Driven Life. But after having made the millions and millions of dollars that he did, he gave significant amounts of money back to the church that had been paying him for decades to be their leader because he was able to do that. God blessed his book. God blessed him with a very, very generous income as a result of that book. And, you can Google it and you can read all about it. I don't know the specific details. And a lot of pastors are like that, especially pastors in larger churches. A lot of the income that they generate that exceeds what you might consider to be a normal salary would be money that they earn off of book sales or conferences or events or other types of curriculum that they create that other churches and other church leaders purchase. So I think a lot of it just depends on, where the money is coming from. I think that a leader of a large organization should be compensated accordingly to the size of the organization that he's leading. So when you're talking about a pastor of a church that maybe has, 5 or 8 or 10 locations and maybe has 10 or 15 or 20,000 people attending, has a large staff of 40 or 50 or 60 people, I think that his compensation should reflect the level of leadership that he's been given in the context of that organization. At the same time, I do think that it is a slippery slope that you're on when you, as a pastor, are living a lavish lifestyle when people in your church congregation are struggling to make ends meet. And I personally, I've never been compensated in a way as a pastor that would make me have to wrestle with that particular issue. But it's one that for me personally, I would struggle with. If I knew that people in my church were struggling and yet they were giving and the money that they were giving was paying a salary for me and I was living a more lavish lifestyle, I think I would probably have a tough time with that. But man, I'm not one to judge other people and to judge their motives. And I certainly don't think that it's easy for us to tell from the outside looking in at what a pastor is actually earning off of the back of his congregation versus what he might actually be earning on work that he's doing outside of his church.
Got you. Okay, so that's interesting data you brought that up, and I kind of want to get to a position of, just if you don't mind, I'll give it like a rebuttal, right? Do you think this is just based off this question? So would it be safe to say that pastors are not supposed to make any money from the church?
No, I don't think that's not biblical. The Apostle Paul writes in the New Testament that that a worker is worth his wage, and he's specifically talking about those that are ministers of the gospel who are serving people in their local church family. There's significant precedence in the New Testament of the Bible that says a man who has been given a responsibility to oversee a local community of Jesus followers, the local church, those that are part of the church should take a collection and take an offering so that he can have his income either taken care of or supplemented. We also know that, being a bivocational pastor, which is what I would consider myself to be right now, I work a job outside of the church so that the church doesn't have to pay me as much, and therefore the church can use more resources to do that. But the church that I'm pastoring right now is a startup church. It's a very small church, and it doesn't require a really significant time commitment. But someone like, I'll use Craig Groeschel as an example, whose church, Life Church, based out of Oklahoma, has 25 or 30 locations, and he's got hundreds and hundreds of people on his staff. He doesn't have time to have another job outside of his calling as the pastor and as the leader of that church. So his compensation, I think, ought to be in accordance to the work and the leadership level that he's expected to give in the context of that church. Again, there's a lot of controversy in the church world in this particular space. And for me personally, I would never want to be in a position where what I'm being paid or the way that I'm living would ever be an obstacle to someone coming to faith in the God that I follow. So for me, that's the big tension for me right there, is that I my job as a minister, as a pastor, is to help people navigate their way to God. And if choices that I'm making and things that I'm doing are preventing people from having an open mind about who God is, then I would probably second guess my own motives.
Okay, fair point. Okay, but let's look at it from this side. There's both sides. There's two sides of every coin, right? So let's say the same scenario of we have the pastors living a lavish life, right? And we have members saying, I'm not going to join that church because he is a millionaire and he's a successful pastor that's worth this and he's got all this stuff and doesn't join, right? Okay, fair. Let's contrast that with the opposite where, someone is looking in and says, wait, pastor walks 5 miles to go to church. I've seen where he lives at and he only has electricity 3 days a month. I don't feel like I want to go there because then again, people see the life, basically the life that they want to see it from the pastor because basically you're in a position of leadership. So in a position of leadership and you're walking 5 miles, I would say this, most people look at that and go, well, I think I might actually go ahead and go to a different church. So won't you say that also will also lose you congregational members as well, if on the opposite spectrum, the pastor basically is struggling to survive?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of let's put it this way. There are something like 350,000 churches in the United States. Mm-hmm. There's all different sizes and all different flavors, all different approaches to the way that ministry and compensation in ministry and finances in the church are managed. It is certainly not biblical that a pastor should take has to take a vow of poverty. That's certainly not, it's not in the Bible. And so I don't believe that, and I wouldn't teach somebody that. I also would caution a church that's not fairly compensating their pastor. And I have that kind of conversation often with churches that I get to work with that are churches that have been struggling or churches that are in decline, churches that are trying to get healthy. And a lot of times when I look at their history with their pastors and the way that they have compensated their pastors, they haven't actually paid them what I would consider to be a market rate. So oftentimes the church in and of itself has not been a good steward with what God has entrusted to them because they're not paying their pastor fairly. For me, the average church size in America is probably about, 70 to 80 people. A church of 70 to 80 people, which is the average church size, is not going to, I think there's a recent report that came out that said the median church size in 2022 or 2023 was something like 70. So the median church of 70 people is not going to be overpaying their pastor. What I would have concerns with is whether actually paying that pastor enough. And it's less because of the perceptions of people on the outside such as the question that you pose, which is, well, people don't want to go to the pastor, to go to that church because that pastor seems to be living in poverty. To me, the question is more about whether or not we're creating undue pressure on that pastor and his family by not compensating him enough. That to me would be a greater concern. I want the pastor to have his needs taken care of so that he can focus on the ministry that God has called him to oversee. And if he's under pressure financially, and if he's, behind the eight ball with his own needs being met, if he can't afford electricity but 3 days a week, then I think that that's a problem in the church, and that's something that needs to be addressed. And I would have a hard time personally respecting a pastor who lets a local church treat him that way. But there are a lot that do. There are a lot of guys that are just simply humble. They feel called to the ministry, and they just want to use the gifts and the talents that God has given them in the context of the ministry, and they're less concerned about the financial aspect of it. You don't go into ministry for money. Nobody does. Even those that are making millions of dollars in ministry today, the TD Jakes, the Stephen Furticks, those that would probably reach that upper echelon of being millionaire pastors, none of them went into it for money. I can guarantee that. The money comes as a result of some sort of some sort of blessing from God. And, what they do with that is totally up to them, and it's totally between them and God. And if they can in good conscience live the way that they live and have what they have, then I'm not one to judge. It's not a lifestyle that I'm living, and it's not a place that I'm in. I haven't had that kind of experience. So I certainly wouldn't want to judge those kinds of guys. But at the same time, I have concerns about the other end of the spectrum, which is churches not compensating or not paying their pastors enough to actually have a livable wage and to be able to care well for their families.
Interesting. I have a question I'm going to ask you. There's a question I actually have that I'm going to ask you in that. But there's something I've been very, very curious in, and hopefully you're probably the best person to answer this. Is how does the compensation work in a church? Like, how does it work? So who decides how much is get paid, and do they touch the offering? Because but this is me growing up as a kid, right? The inner kid in me has always been wanting to ask this question. I've not asked my pastor this because I was like, I don't want to go to hell, so I'm not asking this. But I just since we're in a podcast format, do they touch the offering? Is the offering just left alone? Like, how is that? How does that work?
Every church is completely different because every church has its own unique governance. I will speak to what I think is typically normal, but I wouldn't say that this would necessarily be an across the board in every church situation. If your church is part of a denomination, there's a very good chance that there are salary structures that are put in place by a governing body over that denominational organization. So they may actually have, regional compensation packages and compensation plans. Those compensation plans, just like in any career field, would be based on the tenure of the pastor, how long he has been in a pastorate, how many years of experience he has, what level of education does he have? Does he have a bachelor's degree? Does he have a master's degree? Does he have a doctorate? Does he have multiple doctorates? And also then, what is the size of the church? And then even beyond that, is how many direct reports does he have serving with him on that church staff? So if you have a church of 300 or 350 people, that might be a multiple staff scenario where the senior pastor has, a youth pastor and an associate pastor and a full-time administrative person and a worship leader and a outreach pastor. They might have multiple people that report to them, and therefore they're going to probably be compensated more under that type of compensation structure because they have more direct reports. It'd be very similar in a corporate setting, just usually on a much smaller scale. The offering is typically not touched by the pastor. In most churches, the elders or the trustees or the board would have people assigned called stewards. The stewards would be responsible for taking that money, counting it, accounting for it, making the deposits, making sure that people who are donating to the church are actually getting their charitable receipts that are, issued because they're a 501c3 or a nonprofit. People are getting their charitable receipts. And of course, today in 2023, more and more giving is being done online. So the money is going directly into a church's bank account, while many churches might still pass an offering plate or an offering bag in their worship services. there's probably less and less cash being exchanged as there would have been in generations past. I mean, at the very least, you probably have checks. But my son attends a church that my wife and I visit with him every once in a while. And the pastor actually says that as they pass an offering bucket around, he says, if you're having a tough time and you don't have enough money and you see that bucket passing by you, if there's loose cash in there, feel free to reach in and grab it. It's yours, right? That's the spirit of generosity in that church. But I know that pastor, when those buckets are all passed around, that pastor is not getting the money. The money is going to stewards who are then going to account for it, deposit it, and then make sure that people who are donating, with an offering envelope with their name and their information on it, or a check, that is being accounted for, so that at the end of the year they can get their charitable receipt. Again, every church handles things differently. I work in a space with churches that are in decline, churches that are going through what we would call a revitalization. Many of them have gone through leadership transition. And one of our rules of thumb when we're working with a church and they're in a pastoral search process, we typically recommend, especially they tend to be smaller churches, somewhere between maybe 30 and 130 people. And we ask them to consider setting their pastor's salary to be equivalent of a high school teacher in their school district with a master's degree. Because a lot of times our pastors have master's degrees. They've gone to college and then they go to seminary. And so we say, hey, what does a high school teacher in your community earn who has a master's degree? And we'll pull up the charts from the local school district, and we might see that a high school teacher might make $55,000 or $65,000 or $75,000 plus their benefits. And then we coach the church to try to be somewhere in that same range. And I think that that's normal for a normal size church. And when I say normal size church, that's probably a church of somewhere between 30 people and 300 people. That's probably about what you're looking at. You're looking at a pastor who's being paid what a high school teacher with a master's degree would be paid. Sometimes a little bit more if they have more experience. Maybe they have a doctorate. If they have a doctorate, you might compensate them a little bit more. As the church gets larger and they have more staff members that they're responsible for, more ministry that they're responsible for, then their salary would probably scale up. But it's typically determined by either an organizational governing body, such as a denominational leadership, or it's governed by a local board of directors, elders, trustees, something of that nature, who would set the compensation packages.
Interesting. Okay. That's interesting you said that. So I think that pretty much answers my question for the most part in the sense, in that sense. But I have a question to the regard of the scenario of the pastor walking 5 miles to church with maybe 30 or 40 members, right?
Yeah.
Now, and this leads back to the original story that started the conversation, which was, the acquaintance, a friend of mine, he's actually a pretty good friend of mine, being hesitant to go to the church that I go to because he's like, well, your pastor's rich, so I don't want to go there. So there was a scripture, and I'm reading this off of Google because I had to Google this.
Okay.
Matthew 19:23-26 in the King James Version says, "And again I say unto you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." Right? Okay, that's Google version. That's the New King James Version. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is, let's say this pastor had a congregation of 30, and one day he has the 31st member, and the 31st member happens to be a millionaire, and this person decides and says, "Hey pastor, I will get you a car, I'll get you a house that has electricity 7 days a week." Right? Now, is this individual, because then again this will be classified a wealthy individual per se, right? Now I'm assuming, will this individual go to hell for helping the pastor? This is just a quick question here. Do you think so or no?
I think that the question of heaven and hell has absolutely nothing to do with that at all. Nothing to do with that at all.
Okay, but then again, it's the kingdom of God. That's basically from Matthew 19:23-26. So that's the reason why I brought that up. That's
let's talk about what Jesus actually meant when he said that. Okay. So when a person is wealthy, regardless of how you define wealth, wealth might be, hey, you grew up in a home filled with poverty and you managed to, by your bootstraps, end up in a career where you're earning a 6-figure income, and no one in your family you grew up on food stamps, right? You grew up poor, but you're earning a 6-figure income. You may feel wealthy, or you may be a person who's tracking to be the next Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, and you're going to be a billionaire. The issue here is a heart issue. And the reason that Jesus made this statement is that the issue of heaven and hell is not about behavior. It's not about choices. It's not really about money. It's really about what your God is. And if your God is Jesus, then you're set for heaven. The problem is when people have money, when they have wealth, they tend to make those things their gods. They tend to make those things their idols. Those things take the primary priority in their life. And when that takes the primary priority in your life, it makes it very difficult for you to surrender to God's will for your life because you create your own will. The more wealth you have, you tend to be, the more pride you have, the more power you have, the more opportunity you have. And the more wealth leading to all of those other things can ultimately become the primary focus in your life. And what God wants to do, there's not a wealthy person on planet Earth that God didn't say it's okay for that person to be wealthy. I truly believe that. I believe that God owns everything. He is the owner of everything, and every privilege, every opportunity, every penny that every person has, they have because God is a giver. God is a blesser, and he has blessed pastors with millions, individuals with millions. But God also in his economy is not about wealth. I'm not a name it, claim it kind of person that says, if you want to be rich, God wants you to be rich. God doesn't promise that, but God does have the ability to bless people if that's his choice. And so I would say in that particular scenario, notwithstanding the federal IRS regulations about a wealthy person giving gifts directly to their pastor and what all the implications are there, that is another discussion altogether. But I would say, no, I think that if God has given a wealthy person wealth and they're open-handed with it and they want to bless other people, that actually makes it much easier for them to track with God and to live their life on purpose for the purpose that he's designed them to. If you've got a wealthy person in a church who wants to be a blessing to their church, to be a blessing to their pastor, to be a blessing to the other ministers in the church, to be a blessing to their community in some way, I think that's exactly what God would want them to do with the resources he's given them to. I think for me, for you, for everyone, the reason you have what you have, the reason I have what I have is because God wants to use me. He wants to use you as a conduit to bless others. If you follow God, I follow God. He wants more people to trust him and to know him. And he wants us to use our resources to be a blessing to others so that other people might find the hope in him that we have.
Okay, which is I 100% agree with you. But the reason why I pose this question, which is interesting which is why I said it relates to the original question, is because there seems to be an element of content with wealth and the church. I don't know if you understand, if you get what I mean. There is an element of saying if you are wealthy or if you have any sort of money, you're going to hell. This literally what I grew up on with people close to me, but this is basically as a kid. But they associated success or in some way should perform financial success with, oh, it's from the devil.
Yeah. If your friend who posed that question to you or pushed back on attending your church, I mean, here's the thing. I don't know the answer to this question, but this would be the first question that I would ask is if you won't trust a pastor who is a millionaire, it's one thing for us to judge someone for how much they have or how much they've received, but it's impossible for us to know how much they give. So if I look at someone who looks like they have a ton of money, but I don't know their heart of generosity, that person may be living on 10% of what they make and giving 90% of it away. If they're making $100 million a year and they're living on $10 million a year and giving away, $90 million a year, that to me is an extraordinarily generous person. The scope of their wealth and the scope of their generosity is proportionate to the blessing that they have in their life. And I think that's the first pushback that I would have on someone who says, I can't go to that church because that pastor is wealthy. Well, that pastor has received a lot. It's true, but I don't know how much that pastor gives. And if I know that pastor personally, or if I have the opportunity to get to know that pastor personally, I get to know their heart. I get to know where they're prioritizing the use of their resources. They may be sending more money to foreign missions, to overseas, to helping other nonprofits get started, to helping other ministries. I don't know that. And I'm not going to judge somebody for what they have because I really don't know their heart and I don't know what they're giving. And I think giving is a greater indication of our wealth than our getting is. And that's just my take on it.
Interesting. No, that's an interesting take on it. So, which also kind of now brings me into what you do, because I know you mentioned you basically help. I think a summary would be you basically help churches come into more of the digital world, right? And I'm assuming that's to basically help increase and grow your congregation, because based off the stats you're sharing, I mean, if you have a congregation of less than 70, 60, I think of 60 or 50
Sure.
members, that's a very, very small congregation, if you ask me. I mean, we can go out down in the office right now, because we have a bunch of offices here, and I'd be like, hey, we can have 60 people who can go to a church. But the can you tell people a little bit more about what you do? But before you do that, I have a question. Is Actually, before I ask the question, if you can, just tell people what we should. Then I'm going to share the question I want to ask.
Okay, so you want to hear what it is that I do. Okay, so
Yeah.
I do two different things. Okay, so with the for-profit company that I work with, we work with churches, and I work with churches that are anywhere from 30 people to 30,000 people. I work with very small churches and very large churches. Every church's goal is ultimately to connect people to the message of the gospel, which is the good news of Jesus. God loves them. God wants to have a relationship with them. He's made a way for them to have a relationship through Jesus Christ. That's the churches that I work with. That is our message. We would consider ourselves evangelical Christian churches. Okay. That's the message. That's the message of the gospel. And their ultimate goal is not necessarily to grow their church, but they recognize that as their church grows, it gives them the opportunity to connect more and more people to that message. More and more people find their hope in a relationship with God through Jesus. And certainly a lot of churches have ministries that really address a lot of felt needs and a lot of practical needs. The church that my wife and I are part of for the last 5 years before we started serving in this new church, starting this new church that we're starting, if you walked into our church building on Thursday nights, there were hundreds of people in the building, and they were attending care groups such as divorce care, grief share, Alcoholics Anonymous, Financial Peace University. There were probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 10 different care ministries. The goal isn't to get more and more people into those care ministries. The goal is to get more and more people the care that they need. And so, as we work with that church, and that is one of the churches that I work with, our goal is to help more people who don't yet know that the church exists discover that it exists, and discover what kind of opportunities there are in that church to solve some of the real practical problems that they're looking to solve. And, we recognize that most people who are facing some sort of challenge or some sort of difficulty here in 2024, the first place they're going to look for solutions to their problem are Google and YouTube. They're going to Google and they're Googling how to have a better marriage, how to fix my broken marriage, how to forgive my cheating spouse. Those are the things that people are Googling. I have the analytics to prove it. They're Googling things like how to overcome loss and grief and anxiety and fear and worry. And they're trying to watch YouTube videos on these things. They're trying to find, solutions to these problems on Google. And what we do in our marketing is partner with churches that want to intersect with those people and help them connect their ministries and what they're doing to serve their community with people in the community that are trying to solve those types of problems. And so that's ultimately what we're trying to do there. So we run marketing campaigns, Google search campaigns. We run Facebook and Instagram and Google display and YouTube ad campaigns. We use a variety of different platforms. We do SEO work on the church's website, as well as local SEO, so that they can be found in local searches when people are looking for a church near me, church in their community. And so that's one of the spaces that I work in. It's primarily a church that says, look, we believe that we have something to offer our community. There are too many people in our community who don't know we exist. How can we be where people are? I don't know if you're familiar with the movie The Little Mermaid. Ariel sings a song about wanting to be where the people are. And that's what the church wants. The church wants to be where the people are, because without people, we don't really have the ability to do what God has called us to do. And where are the people? The people are on Facebook, they're on Instagram, they're on TikTok, they're on social media platforms, and they're certainly on Google. And so we want to leverage those platforms to help people intersect with those churches to get solutions to the problems that they're facing in day-to-day life, and ultimately to the spiritual solution, which is, where do they stand when it comes to their relationship with God? would they spend eternity with God in heaven, or are they going to spend eternity separated from God? And ultimately, that's the church's message that it wants to communicate. But we recognize that a lot of people have a lot of issues that need to be dealt with before they ever start asking the spiritual questions. So that's one lane that I work in. The other lane that I work in is working with churches that are in a season of revitalization, churches that might have been 100 or 200 or 300 people in the past, but they have failed to kind of either keep up with the times, or maybe they've gone through some difficult situations financially or with a leader, and the church has been in decline for some time. And so I work with those churches to try to help them get healthy, which is to try to really sort of rediscover who God has called them to be, what's the DNA of their church, what's the culture of the church that they want to establish. Ultimately, for a large church, like the church that I mentioned a few minutes ago that has all of these different care ministries, they can offer many different things to many people. A smaller church can't offer as many things. And so what I want to do is work with them to discover how they are uniquely propositioned to meet a need in the community. What kinds of partnerships can they form with other organizations in the community that can help them improve the quality of people's lives, and ultimately to get people into a place where they can hear the message of the gospel, the good news about Jesus and the fact that God loves them and wants to have a relationship with them. So we're starting from a relatively unhealthy place, but really doing a hard evaluation on where we are as a church, what kinds of things do we need to do to get healthy, and then taking them on a 2 to 3 year journey to sort of turn the ship so that they get into a place where they're able to actually effectively offer ministry to their community in a way that's going to make an impact.
Interesting. So, quick question: do you ever get any pushback from any churches that say, "I don't want to go digital. I don't think we need this. I don't want to. I think if God is going to bring us our members."
The honest truth is, in the space that I'm in, most of the churches are coming to me for help, or my team. And they recognize that there's an opportunity that they're not fully capitalizing on as it relates to the digital space. There are very few churches that I have encountered over the years that would say they don't want to do anything digital. I think the COVID-19 pandemic, churches being shut down in 2020, was a rude awakening for a lot of churches, especially those that didn't have some kind of digital presence, because they began to realize that, if we're unable to have Sunday morning worship services, if our buildings are shut down, does that mean that we don't have anything to offer the community? And the real answer to that is, well, no, you should still have things that you can offer to the community. You should still be able to do ministry. You're just going to have to pivot like a lot of other businesses did and figure out a way to deliver what you can deliver digitally. And so, we work with a lot of churches. I was working with missional marketing when the whole world shut down back in 2020. And we really helped a lot of churches that at that time had very little or no digital presence really begin to establish one, so that they could connect with people who hadn't yet walked through their physical doors on a Sunday morning, but who had spiritual questions or other issues that they needed help with. And we can find ways to do that digitally. So there are churches out there. I know, Emmanuel, there are churches out there that are just like, yeah, we don't really want to have anything to do with the digital space. It's not for us. It just doesn't feel authentic. It doesn't feel organic. And I would say it's going to be very, very difficult for those churches to maintain their ministry long term, because the generations that are coming up behind us, the 20 somethings and the 30 somethings and even the teens, younger, they're digital natives. They do everything online. They do everything online first before it translates into incarnational community. My son, 20 something years old, it's just the world that he lives in. He meets people playing video games. If he's going to date, he starts on an app. He goes to college classes. He has a job. He's with other people, but almost everything that is intentional in his life starts somewhere online. And I think that as a church, we have to recognize that if we're going to start new relationships with people and we're going to engage with people, we've got to figure out how to start that online.
Interesting. Okay. So you help them basically go online. So if a church gives a pushback, you're like, hey, listen, everything's going digital. I have a question for you. So this is going to pose off of a story. So interestingly, I was having a conversation with it was fairly an acquaintance. We know each other a little bit. And we were talking about, the church, kind of same thing. We were talking about the ministry, but the conversation was very broad. But he said, if I wanted to make money, I would go start a church. Interesting. So I go,
It's a bad
interesting.
idea. Let me just say that's a bad idea.
But this is the premise of it. This is the premise of it. And I was like, okay, I actually do agree. If you have the right marketing, I think it'll work. But this is the premise because one, there's two parts to it. So the first thing first is he wants to start a church in the sense of making money. But then again, I was like, okay. So I started going up, we started analyzing the logics of it, right? Like, how would you get the money? And they were like, well, the Bible says give your offering and tithes. Your tithes and offering should be paid. So technically, if you have enough congregation members and giving the offering and tithes and 10%, you have a profitable business. But that's basically it. So what he was going off of was saying that not all churches, this is not me. This is then again, this is just basically based off the conversation. Most churches are in the business of business, not in the business of actually getting the word of Christ out. Right. And the reason why I'm posing this question is, and there's a question I want to ask you from it, is because his position is like maybe somebody out there is thinking like, wow, or maybe somebody already has. It's like, I want to make some money, and it says here in this verse here that you have to pay your tithes and offering, and and I am in a church right now, and there's 500 members, and they're giving 10%, and if 100 give 10%, and it's 1,000, now guess what? You just make 100,000, give or take, hypothetically. So this is my question. Do you believe we live in the age of false prophets and a lot of people who start churches or start a ministry aren't necessarily doing it for the sake of the word, but you're doing it for the sake of your pockets?
Well, I think there have been false prophets as long as there have been people on planet Earth. So, do we live in an age of false prophets? Yeah, I think that there are plenty of people out there that are propagating spiritual truths that are untrue. From a standpoint of being a Bible believing church, we'll dispel a couple of myths. Number one, we don't live under the law; we live under grace, and so yes, there is a biblical principle of giving a tithe, 1/10 of your income, but we don't live under the law, and that's not a requirement. And I have personally never been in a church or experienced connection with a church where people are demanded that they need to give 10% in order to be a part of that church. It's just not biblical. And most people would probably not stick around with that church for very long. The last numbers that I read indicate that for most churches, the average weekly giving is equal to about 25 or so dollars per person per week. So let's do the math. If you have a church of 100 people, then you're probably going to average about $2,500 in giving per week. That's not a ton of money. If you have 1,000 members of your church or attendees on the weekend and you're averaging about $25, that's only $25,000 per week. Now, if you have 1,000 people, you probably have a large building with a lot of overhead. You probably have a large staff and multiple people that you have to pay. And you also have to recognize, again, that most of the time, in most churches that have a healthy, biblically based governance, the pastor does not decide his salary, and the pastor does not have the access to those funds. So to say you're going to go start a church to earn money is not the same thing as saying I'm going to go start a marketing company, or I'm going to go start open a fitness center, or I'm going to go open a store or a restaurant where you as the owner decide what your salary is, and you work to increase your own profit margins. And the more profit you make, the more you get to take home. Churches don't work that way. Not good, healthy, biblical churches. Now, does that mean that there aren't pastors and church leaders out there that are abusive of people in their congregation, or that they're abusing the trust of the people in their congregation? I'm sure there are. I'm not friends with any of those people, and nor again would I be one to sit and judge what somebody else is doing. I don't think it's a healthy thing for me to do, and it's certainly not something that I have a lot of experience and a lot of exposure to. But none of us are ignorant of the fact that there are guys that come on TV and tell people to send their ministry money so that they can buy private jets. That happens. Do I think that that is biblical and warranted? No, absolutely not. I think it's a joke, and I feel really sorry for people who actually give to those ministries, because I think they're being foolish. I don't think that they're being good stewards with what God has entrusted to them. I think they're being foolish when they do that. But to answer your question, are there people out there that are taking advantage of people, for sure. There always have been. I think there always will be. I don't think that's nothing new. But a good, healthy biblical church is going to have a good, healthy governance structure, which is going to bring accountability to the pastor and to the other leaders in the church. And there's going to be a fiscal or a financial accountability that comes with that.
Interesting. Okay, so I want to play the part of the I want to play the part of basically the congregational member. The scenario you gave, or the example you gave of donate to my church so I can buy a private jet. Hey, maybe you say, I'm thinking maybe a good selling point would be, well, so we can reach more people and spread the gospel. But now people go, okay, oh my God, I need to definitely donate. And I send my $100. Somebody spends $25 and people send, and the next you know, pastor's got a private jet. Now, could that be good or bad? Maybe good, maybe bad. But let's look at it from a perspective of somebody who is given as a congregational member. Now, how are people able to discern? Because the last thing people want is to be lied to and taken advantage of, right? Because no one wants to be taken advantage of, right? So then think about it from a perspective of how are the congregation members able to discern and say, hey, I'm actually in the right church and I'm actually given, or in a position of like, well, maybe pastor's just trying to just take my money. What do you?
Well, I think, it's really hard. It's sort of like, we live in a free country where people are at liberty to do what they want to do with their money. At the time that you and I are recording this, there was recently a Powerball lottery. I think that was something like $900 million or something crazy like that. And I'm sure that there are clearly a lot of people that went out to play the lottery, to buy their Powerball tickets, and to use their resources on the potential, the very, very small potential of winning a ton of money. If that's what they choose to do with their money, that's fine. There are some, financial leaders in our country that would simply say a lottery is a tax on the poor, because it's typically not your millionaires that are going out and buying, lottery tickets to try to win millions of dollars. It's typically people who are less affluent that are spending their money on that. I don't know that I can necessarily speak to what people need to do or should do. I think there's certainly a level of discernment that people have. This is one of the reasons that Christian community is such an important thing. I'm going to play devil's advocate here. If I'm sitting at home and I'm watching these late night television preachers who are saying, send money to my ministry so that I can buy a private jet, I'm going to bet that person probably does not have a real strong local faith community, and they don't have a whole lot of accountability in relationships with people in their local faith community. And therefore, they are probably more susceptible to somebody who is doing something like that. I'm going on a limb here because I don't know that for sure. I mean, it's just a guess purely. But there have always been people who prey on those that are vulnerable, who prey on those that are more innocent, who prey on those that maybe are less intellectually sophisticated. That's just the way of the world. And unfortunately, from time to time, some of those people come in the disguise of being a man of God or a woman of God, a pastor or a preacher or some sort of church leader. And I feel for those people, because I think that they're giving to something that, it's probably not going to produce the fruit that they hope that it will. I don't really know how, I don't really know how to speak to that exactly, Emmanuel. It's a complicated situation, but I think that, we do need to test everything in the Bible first. And I think that you can tell a lot about a person's character by the way that they use the resources that they're given. If you need, I don't know, $100 million or whatever a private jet costs for the purpose of a private jet, in my head, I'm doing the math. How much local ministry could I do? How many more people could I help? What could I do with that $100 million rather than spending on a jet? That's just me. And again, I can't speak for everyone, but boy, if you're in my circle of influence, I'm going to help you hopefully make better decisions than that.
Okay, perfect. So I've got a few rapid fire questions here for you.
Okay.
As we wrap up.
All right.
So the first one is if this is just, then again, it's a fun question. So if hell was real, what state of the union would it be?
If hell was real, what state of the union would it be? Man, if I can't incriminate myself, And I can't incriminate myself because I work in churches in almost all 50 states. But let's just put it this way. I'm from Texas, so it's not Texas. And you can probably guess what states Texans probably appreciate the least. And I'm just going to leave it at that. Can't answer that question.
Okay, got you. But this is an interesting. This is actually not really a fun one, but this is more of a. If you had to say in 3 words to an atheist that they need to convert and basically one true God, what would you say?
Well, if you're an atheist and you don't believe that there is a God, um, I would probably say this. I can live my entire life following this delusion, you might call it a delusion, that God is real and that his son Jesus was real and that this message of the gospel is true. And in the end, I get to the end and I die. And if there's nothing after this life, then the joke's on me. There's no consequence to that. But if you as a person are denying God, denying the existence of God, denying that there's a God who loves you and wants to have a relationship with you, and he's made a way for that to happen through his son Jesus, and you deny that your entire life, and you get to the end and I'm right and you're wrong, the consequences of your decision are eternal. And I don't want that for you. I want you to believe what I believe, mostly from my own personal experience, what God has done in and through my life, the way he's shown up in some of the darkest seasons of my life, the way that I've seen him turn other people's lives around. That's what I want for you. And it's not because of a religious thing. I'm not a religious person at all. I'm a person of deep faith, deeply convicted faith. I believe the Bible is true. There's a lot of it that I still wrestle with, even a person of faith. There's a lot that I still wrestle with. And I know a lot of people wrestle with the Bible and the validity of what's written in the Bible. But there's enough there for me to look at it and say, I want it to be true. I need it to be true. I believe that it's true. And if you're a person who hasn't yet embraced the fact that there's a God, that he loves you and that he wants to have a relationship with you, man, I say, give it a shot. What could the gamble hurt in taking a risk on whether or not there is a real God and that he loves you and wants to have a relationship with you?
Got you. I love it. That's a great one. All right, last one. If Jesus was standing in front of you and he said, you could ask me one question, what question would it be?
Man, this is going to get emotional, and I hope you're okay with this. I lost my youngest son to suicide almost 3 years ago. And I believe that he is with Jesus in heaven today. He was 16 years old and he took his own life. So the question that I would ask is, how's my boy? Because I'm longing for that deep connection with my son that I don't get to have anymore because he left this earth. And when I said that God has been with me in some deep, dark, troubling times, these last few years have been pretty rough for me and for my family, but we held out hope that our son is with Jesus and that we will be reunited with him someday. And of all the questions that I could ask, I know there's a million questions that I could ask about creation and the origins of the universe and all that's to come. But if I'm to be perfectly honest with you, Emmanuel, it's going to be a question about my son. How's my boy? Does he miss me? I can't wait to see him again.
Well, that is definitely unique because the reason why I can relate to that is because I lost my sister to suicide as well. So I could that's something that is definitely because if I was asked that one question, I would honestly what I would ask God is just like why did he take them when they were the one people that lived exactly by the book? Why them? So that's my whole thing. That's basically it. But then again, obviously, what's next for you as we wrap up before we get all emotional and tears start flying, and then next thing you know, everyone is like, and then we have the audience crying because if you're watching on Spotify, I know you probably listen to the audio. It's fine. You're in your car. It's okay. You can shed a few tears. Just kidding. But I'm recovering from a cold. But what's next for you?
What's next for me? Well, I actually recently I released a book. It's a 40-day prayer experience for churches that I actually just released back in October. And I've got a lot of churches around the country that are working through this 40. It's called Praying for Renewal in Our Church. And it's a book that people are using, that churches are using as congregations to pray for renewal in the course of their church. I actually released another book. It's an ebook. It is called Relationships Make Christmas Complicated. Now, we're recording this after Christmas, but if you're a person who has relationships that make your Christmas complicated, you should read it between now and next Christmas so that it can help you navigate the complexities of Christmas that come if you have relationships that make Christmas complicated. The next thing that's on my list of things to do, Emmanuel, is I actually came out of this Christmas season with a plan to write a book called Grief Makes Christmas Complicated. As you've lost someone close to you, I've lost someone close to me. I can guarantee you that you have hundreds, if not thousands, of listeners who have all lost someone who is close to them. And the holidays are sometimes some of the most difficult times to reconcile the fact that there's someone that we love who isn't with us, somebody who's missing from the party, someone who's missing from the dinner table. And so I plan to spend a good bit of time this year writing this book called Grief Makes Christmas Complicated. And I hope to have that available for publish in the fall so that people can get it in their hands and read it before Christmas of 2024 so that maybe, just maybe, they can have a little more comfort and a little more ease going into the Christmas season if they've lost a loved one.
Love it. The link. So obviously the links, guys, as you're watching this, wherever you are, if you watch on YouTube or you were watching on Spotify, or on Apple Podcasts, just realized we have it on Apple Podcasts as well, or Rumble. Actually, I just realized. I actually remember that.
Anywhere you listen or watch your favorite podcasts.
Anywhere you listen to, do me a favor, go in the description right now. There's going to be links to get the books, to see what Bart's working on. And Bart, I would also love to have you on when you get bring the when you release your new book, Grief, makes Christmas complicated. And we're going to make sure we put a disclaimer out that everyone should basically have some napkins, because we're going to have some tears. It's going to be coming out then. But Bart, anything last words as we wrap up here?
No, you know what? I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to share today. Our conversation didn't necessarily go the direction that I thought it was going to go. You're an interesting inquisitor, but your audience is not my audience. I do have my own podcast, and my podcast is focused on church marketing and church communications. It's called the Missional Marketing Podcast. And, maybe there's a person in your audience somewhere that might be an interesting topic or interesting conversation. A lot of the things that we talk about in terms of marketing and digital outreach apply to business and apply to nonprofit worlds, not just churches. But that's one of the spaces that I get to be in. But your audience is a very different audience than mine. So I considered a privilege that you invited me to be on the show so that I could share a little bit of my story and a little bit of my experience with them. And hopefully it's been a blessing and a little bit eye-opening. Hopefully they're rethinking a little bit about the church and church finances and ultimately God. That's what I would love for people to be rethinking.
No, I love it. I love it. I mean, then again, it's mostly business, but I always say that if you, I can't remember, there's three things that you need to, someone said there's three people or so, three things that you need. So one, you need a spiritual leader in every business. So I have my pastor, and if whenever there's something, before I even go ahead and, launch any new venture, I'm always like, hey, I'm going to be doing this. Should I do it? Because I remember someone told me this. I started a business that I lost thousands of dollars in, hundreds of thousands, actually came up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And
I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh. That's painful.
it is painful, but but then again, it's some people learn the hard, life teaches you lessons. Some people learn the hard way. Some people learn the harder way. So, but I remember this question this young lady told me. She has a very successful online business. She said, when I told her what happened, she goes, well, I have one question for you. I was like, what? She goes, well, did you ever ask God before you did it? I said, oh, no kidding. I never did. So I was like, okay, well, I guess so now anything I do, I was like, hey, should I do it? And the pastor's like, hey, let's pray about it. But I think one, a spiritual leader, and then two, you need somebody who's a subject matter expert. Obviously, if you're going to go to marketing, you market your business, you need someone who's a subject matter expert. And then three, you need somebody who's an outsider looking in, who has no clue, whatever. Best person to ask is your kid. Like I have a 5-year-old, and you ask yourself, if your 5-year-old, this is funny, but it's interesting. Is it's funny, they say most people read at the 5th grade level. Mm-hmm. Right. So if your product is, let's say, a phone, right? And if your 5-year-old or maybe a 10-year-old cannot understand your product, then more than likely the market won't understand your product.
There you go.
But yeah, That's pretty much it. And then again, guys, please don't forget to go. The links are going to be here in the description to also go check out Bart's podcast. Even if you're not into marketing, definitely go. If you're not in church, definitely go support. Because I think, as you guys know who listen to me, I definitely like to ask questions that being honest with you guys, none of my guests ever expect the part where we're going to go. But there's something that was interesting. I was like, oh my God, I want to talk about this. But yeah. Pastor, is it okay if I call you Pastor?
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know, as you know, there's a part of me that felt like I was disrespecting you when I said Bart, because I was like, he's a pastor.
No, Bart's my given name. Some people call me Pastor Bart. Some people call me Bart. Some people call me bad names, but I'll take any of it.
That's all right, Pastor Bart. Well, it's a pleasure having you on. And then again, guys, don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe. And if you are on Spotify, please go ahead and hit the follow button and